He freed more people in a single decree than lived in the entire United States at the time. 23 million Russian serfs, men, women, and children who had been legally bound to the land and their masters for generations, who could be bought and sold, beaten, separated from their families, exiled to Siberia at their lord's whim, received their freedom on a single day in March 1861. Alexander II, Tsar of all the Russias, signed the Emancipation Manifesto and became the most consequential reformer in Russian history, possibly in European history of the 19th century. 20 years later, he was blown apart by a bomb on a St. Petersburg street. The bomb was thrown by a member of a revolutionary organization that believed he hadn't gone far enough. This is one of history's more savage ironies. The man who did the most to transform Russia was killed by people who wanted more transformation. The Tsar Liberator, murdered by the liberation movement he had helped create. The story of Alexander II and the end of Russian serfdom is a story about what happens when you try to change a system that everyone agrees is rotten, how you please no one, lose everyone, and transform your country in ways you never intended and couldn't control. Russian serfdom was not slavery, technically. The law was careful about this distinction. A lord did not own his serfs the way an American planter owned enslaved people. He owned the land, and the serfs were attached to it. When an estate was sold, the serfs came with it. When an estate was divided between heirs, the serfs were divided too. A serf could not move, could not marry without permission, could not choose a trade or enter a business without the lord's consent. The lord could send a serf to Siberia as punishment for virtually any offense, real or imagined. A serf who displeased his master had essentially no legal recourse. In practice, the distinction between serfdom and slavery was largely philosophical. Serfs were bought and sold, families were separated at auction, nobles with gambling debts paid them off with human beings. Russia in the mid-19th century had 23 million people, roughly one-third of the entire population, living under conditions that Western European observers described in terms indistinguishable from those they applied to the American South. The difference was one of degree and legal classification, not of lived experience. The nobility who owned these serfs numbered about 103,000 families, 1% of the population controlling the labor of 34%. The system had sustained them for 2 centuries. Serfdom was not just their economic base, it was their social identity, their source of political power, the foundation of everything that made them what they were. When reformers talked about ending serfdom, the nobility heard talk of their own annihilation. Russian czars had been aware for decades that serfdom was a problem. Alexander I had appointed committees to study the question. Nicholas I had expressed private conviction that serfdom must eventually end while doing almost nothing to end it. The arguments were always the same. The peasants are too primitive for freedom. The disruption would be too severe. The nobility cannot be ruined. Wait until conditions are more favorable. The conditions were never more favorable. What changed was the Crimean War. In 1853, Russia went to war with Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire over influence in the Black Sea region. What Russia expected to be a short demonstration of great power ended in catastrophe. The Russian army, supposedly the strongest in Europe, the same army that had crushed Napoleon, was defeated on its own territory by a coalition that had to fight thousands of miles from home. The fortresses fell. The fleet was scuttled. The terms of peace were humiliating. Russia ceded territory, lost its right to a Black Sea fleet, and watched Britain and France dictate terms in its own backyard. The defeat exposed something that the Russian establishment had been avoiding looking at directly. The empire was structurally backward. Its army was conscripted from serfs who served for 25 years and were trained in tactics obsolete before they completed their service. Its logistics were primitive because there were almost no railways, and the roads turned to mud. Its industry was minimal because there was no free labor market. The serfs who might have worked in factories were attached to land, and the lords who owned them had no incentive to release them. Russia was losing not because its soldiers were weak, but because its entire social and economic system was incompatible with modern warfare. Alexander II became Tsar in 1855, inheriting the war and its consequences. He was 36 years old, well educated, genuinely liberal by the standards of Russian autocrats, and acutely aware of what the Crimea meant. In March 1856, in his first public statement on the subject, he told a gathering of Moscow nobility, "The existing condition of owning souls cannot remain unchanged. It is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for the time when it begins to abolish itself from below." The nobility heard the threat. They began to prepare their objections. Drafting the Emancipation took 5 years, and those 5 years were a masterclass in how a reform gets diluted before it reaches the people it's supposed to help. The process began in 1857 when Alexander established provincial committees of nobles to study the serf question and propose solutions. Letting the landowners design the emancipation of their own serfs was either a stroke of political genius or a recipe for disaster, perhaps both. It made it impossible for nobles to simply refuse. If they were the ones drafting the terms, they could hardly claim the exercise was being done to them rather than by them. It also meant that every committee was staffed by men with a direct financial interest in giving serfs as little as possible. The arguments in the committees were fierce. Nobles from agricultural provinces, where the land was rich and labor was the primary asset, wanted to keep as much land as possible and free serfs with minimal allocations, making them economically dependent on their former masters immediately after liberation. Nobles from the north, where serfs often supplemented their income through crafts and trade rather than agriculture, cared less about land and more about maintaining cash payments. Everyone agreed that the peasants would need to compensate landlords for whatever land they received. The question was how much, for how long, and whether the terms would leave peasants free in any meaningful sense or merely dead enslaved under a new name. The Central Editorial Commission, staffed by younger liberal officials who genuinely wanted meaningful reform, fought the conservative nobility at every turn. The result was a compromise that satisfied neither side and that historians have been arguing about ever since. What emerged from 5 years of fighting was this: serfs would be freed immediately and completely as legal persons. They could marry without permission, own property, enter trades, take legal action. The personal bondage was gone, but the land, the essential question, was more complicated. Peasants would receive land allocations, but the allocations were calculated to give landlords the best parcels and leave peasants with less, and often worse, ground than they had previously worked. The famous Otreski, cut-off lands, were tracts transferred from peasant use to landlord ownership in the Emancipation settlement, often including forests, rivers, and roads that peasants now had to pay fees to access. For the land they did receive, peasants would pay redemption payments over 49 years. Not rent, purchase. The government would advance the money to landlords immediately, in bonds, and peasants would repay the state with interest. The catch, which became apparent quickly, was that the land had been valued at roughly twice its market rate. Peasants were paying 49 years of installments on land that had been overpriced to compensate landlords for losing not just the land but the labor that had previously come with it. The commune, the mir, was made the basic unit of the new peasant order. Land was assigned collectively to village communes, not to individual families. The commune was responsible for distributing allotments, collecting taxes, and ensuring that redemption payments were made. Since the commune was jointly liable for the debts of all its members, it had strong incentives to prevent individual peasants from leaving. A peasant who wanted to travel more than 20 miles needed an internal passport from the commune. The man who had been tied to his lord was now tied to his village with a different set of chains and a different set of creditors. The Tsar signed the manifesto on March 3, 1861. The Emancipation Manifesto was read aloud in churches across Russia 2 weeks after it was signed. The reaction among the peasants was not what anyone expected, or rather it was not what Alexander had hoped. Many peasants simply refused to believe the document was genuine. The land they were being given, in smaller quantities than they had previously worked, at prices that seemed designed to keep them in debt forever. This could not be the real emancipation. The real manifesto surely was being hidden by the landlords and officials who had always cheated them. Rumors spread that a second, real manifesto had been suppressed, that the Tsar had given the land freely but the nobles were stealing it. In 1861 alone, scholars have counted roughly 1,889 peasant disturbances across the empire. Riots, refusals to sign the land inventories, attacks on estate offices, cases where troops had to be called to restore order. The most serious of these was at Bezna, in the Kazan province, where a literate peasant named Anton Petrov convinced several thousand people that he had found the true meaning of the manifesto. The land was free, the serfs were free, and the nobles were lying. Thousands gathered at Bezna to hear him interpret the manifesto. Troops arrived. When the crowd refused to disperse, the soldiers fired. The official toll was 51 dead. Other accounts put it higher. Petrov was arrested and executed. The intelligentsia had its own reaction, which was different in content but similar in intensity. Liberal intellectuals who had been hoping for genuine constitutional reform, a parliament, guaranteed rights, press freedom, watched the Emancipation Manifest as a social reform that left political autocracy entirely intact. Alexander had freed the serfs. He had not moved Russia toward representative government, had not limited his own power, had not created any mechanism by which subjects could participate in governance. The reform was large. It was also, by itself, insufficient. A new generation of radicals was crystallizing, shaped partly by Alexander's reforms and partly by their limitations. The emancipation had demonstrated that change was possible. The Russian state could be moved. The ancient structure could shift. It had also demonstrated that change coming from above would always be calibrated to protect the existing order. If the Tsar's emancipation left 23 million people in debt, tied to their villages, working smaller parcels than they had before, perhaps the answer was not to petition the Tsar for better reforms, but to remove the Tsar entirely. In the universities, radical student circles were forming. The word nihilism was spreading, borrowed from Turgenev's novel Fathers and Sons, published in 1862, in which a character embodying a new type of young Russian dismisses everything his elders held sacred. In the countryside, young educated radicals were going among the peasants, the movement called Going to the People, trying to explain revolutionary ideas to men and women who mostly just wanted better terms on their redemption payments and couldn't follow the ideology. Alexander had started the 1860s as a reformer. By the mid-1860s, events were pushing him in a different direction. The Polish uprising of 1863 was the first shock. Alexander had allowed a degree of liberalization in Poland after 1861, and Polish nationalists had interpreted this as an opening for independence. When the uprising began, Alexander suppressed it with the same firmness his father had applied in 1831. The suppression was harsh, the aftermath severe. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or exiled to Siberia. The Polish provinces were subjected to intensive Russification. The liberal Tsar, who had freed the serfs, was also the Tsar who crushed Polish aspirations with military force. In April 1866, a young man named Dmitry Karakozov walked up to Alexander as he was leaving the summer garden in St. Petersburg and fired a pistol at him. The shot missed. A bystander reportedly knocked the gun as it fired. Karakozov was seized, tried, and hanged. But the assassination attempt marked a turning point in Alexander's reign. From 1866 onward, the liberal ministers, who had driven the great reforms of the 1860s, were systematically replaced by conservatives. University autonomy was curtailed. Press censorship increased. The brief window of relative openness began to close. The reforms continued. Judicial reform, local government reform, military reform, but the political atmosphere shifted. Alexander had seen the face of the people who wanted to kill him, and they were young, educated, and angry not at his conservatism, but at his insufficient liberalism. His response was to become more conservative, which created more angry young people, which confirmed his instinct to be more conservative. The cycle fed on itself. Meanwhile, the redemption payments were grinding the freed peasants into the ground. The debt that had been loaded onto the emancipation was producing exactly the resentment that Alexander had feared serfdom itself would produce. Peasants who had expected genuine freedom found themselves still tied to their villages, paying forever for land that had been overvalued, unable to leave without the commune's permission, watched by the same officials who had watched their fathers and grandfathers. The population was growing faster than the land allocations could absorb. Families that had been given adequate allotments in 1861 found those allotments divided among multiple children a generation later, and divided again the generation after that. The plots grew smaller, the debt grew larger, the resentment accumulated. Narodnaya Volya, the people's will, was formed in 1879, and its 22-member executive committee made a decision that year that would define the next 2 years of Russian history. Alexander II would be killed. The decision was not impulsive. The people's will believed that the Tsar's assassination would detonate a revolution, that the Russian people, shocked by the death of their ruler, would rise against the autocracy and demand transformation. The theory was wrong, as it turned out, but it was held with absolute conviction by the men and women who organized one of the most sustained assassination campaigns in 19th century history. Between August 1879 and March 1881, they tried to kill Alexander at least 5 times. They planted explosives under the railway line he was expected to travel on. They got a revolutionary named Stefan Kalturin hired as a carpenter in the Winter Palace, where he spent months smuggling explosives into a basement storeroom directly beneath the Tsar's dining room. On February 5th, 1880, he set off the charge. The explosion killed 11 guards and wounded 30 others. The Tsar was unhurt. Dinner had been delayed by the late arrival of a guest, and Alexander was not yet in the dining room when the floor below it erupted. The blast in the Winter Palace itself, in the heart of the Tsar's personal residence, terrified the court. Alexander appointed a new minister of interior, Count Loris Melikov, and gave him extraordinary powers both to suppress the terrorists and to pursue conciliation with moderate reformers. Loris Melikov understood that repression alone would not solve the problem. He proposed a modest constitutional measure, 2 legislative commissions with indirectly elected representatives, which would give educated Russian society some voice in legislation. It was far less than Western liberals would have called a constitution. It was also for Russia a significant step. Alexander hesitated for months. In January 1881, he approved the plan in principle and asked for further study. In late February, the police arrested Andrei Zhelyabov, the leader of the assassination plot, and Alexander perhaps allowed himself to believe the immediate danger had passed. On March 1st, 1881, the day the Julian calendar marks as his death, Alexander signed the Loris Melikov Constitution and gave orders for it to be announced. Then he went for his Sunday drive to the Mikhailovsky Manege, as he did every week, along the same route he always took. Sofia Perovskaya, who had taken command of the operation after Zhelyabov's arrest, had positioned her bombers along the Catherine Canal. When the carriage passed, Nikolai Rysakov threw the first bomb. The explosion killed 2 Cossacks from the escort and wounded several bystanders. Alexander was unhurt. He stepped out of the carriage. A second bomber, Ignacy Hrynevietsky, moved toward him and detonated his device at close range. Alexander's legs were blown off. He was carried to the Winter Palace and died within hours. His family gathered around him. The floor of the room soaked with his blood. The Loris Melikov Constitution was never announced. Alexander III, who ascended to the throne that afternoon, asked the ministers whether his father had actually signed the document. They said he had. Alexander III tore it up. The people's will had expected revolution. What followed instead was reaction. Alexander III was his father's opposite in almost every way that mattered. Where Alexander II had been thoughtful and genuinely troubled by Russia's backwardness, his son was a large, physically imposing man with absolute convictions and no patience for ambiguity. He believed in autocracy, orthodoxy, and Russian nationalism with the fervor of someone who had watched the opposite beliefs get his father killed. Within weeks of the assassination, he had reversed the trajectory of the previous 20 years. Liberal ministers were dismissed. The Statute of Increased Security, passed in August 1881, gave the government emergency powers across vast regions of the empire. Powers to arrest without charge, ban public gatherings, close schools, subject entire provinces to quasi-martial law. The statute was supposed to be temporary. It remained in force until 1917. The 5 members of the People's Will Executive Committee who could be arrested were hanged in April 1881. The organization itself was hunted down and effectively destroyed over the following years. The revolution they had predicted did not materialize. The peasants, who had heard of the Tsar's death and waited to see what it meant for their debts and their land, found that it meant nothing good. The new Tsar was not going to relax the redemption payments or enlarge their allotments. He was going to make sure nothing like his father's fate happened again. What remained from Alexander II's reforms was more durable than the revolutionaries who killed him had anticipated. The emancipation itself was not reversed. 23 million freed serfs could not be put back into bondage, and no one seriously proposed trying. The judicial reforms, the zemstvos, the relaxation of censorship that Alexander had permitted in the 1860s, all of these had created institutions and habits that would persist, constrained but not destroyed, through the reactionary reigns of Alexander III and Nicholas II. The Russia that stumbled into the 20th century was not the Russia that had existed before 1861. Serfdom was gone. A small but growing industrial working class had formed in the cities. A peasantry that had been legally bound was now legally free, even if economically crushed. The redemption payments ran until 1907, when a revolution and the political pressure it created finally forced the government to cancel them. By then, 46 years of installments had been paid on land that had been overvalued to begin with. The serfs freed in 1861 had mostly died. Their children and grandchildren finished paying. The deepest irony of the emancipation is not that Alexander was killed for doing too little. It is that the thing he did, the liberation itself, set in motion forces he could not control, created expectations he could not satisfy, and produced the political conditions for everything that followed. A Russia with 23 million freed serfs and a growing industrial proletariat and an educated intelligentsia reading Karl Marx was a fundamentally different country than the one that had existed before the manifesto. The old structures that had maintained order were gone. The new structures that might have channeled the resulting energies, a parliament, guaranteed rights, genuine political representation, were never built, blocked first by the nobility's resistance, and then by Alexander's growing conservatism, and then by his son's absolute rejection of the entire idea. The revolution that the people's will hoped to trigger in 1881 came in 1905 instead, provoked by military humiliation in the East. It came again in 1917, provoked by military catastrophe in the West. Both times, the grievances of the liberated peasantry, land-hungry, debt-burdened, tied to villages they couldn't leave, were central to the upheaval. Alexander himself, in the months before his death, had apparently understood that something further was needed. The Loris-Melikov constitution that he signed on the morning of March 1st was a small step toward representation, a modest opening of the closed autocratic system. He signed it knowing it wouldn't be enough for the radicals. Perhaps he hoped it would be enough for the moderates. He died before he could find out, on the same day he signed it, in the same city where he had freed 23 million people 20 years earlier. The Church of the Spilled Blood was built on the site of the assassination, an ornate, onion-domed cathedral that still stands in St. Petersburg today, directly over the spot on the Catherine Canal where Alexander's carriage stopped and his life ended. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in Russia. Inside, under a canopy, is a section of the original cobblestones from 1881, preserved exactly as they were, the pavement where the Tsar who freed the serfs bled out in the snow. 23 million people had been liberated. The man who did it died on that cobblestone. What came after, the debt, the reaction, the slow accumulation of rage, the revolution, grew from the same ground as the liberation itself. Alexander had been right in 1856. It was better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait for it to be abolished from below. What he could not have known was that abolishing it from above would unleash the very forces that the abolition from below would have embodied anyway. He freed Russia. Russia didn't know what to do with the freedom, and neither, in the end, did he.